Welcome to Theodore Fried, In Hiding and Beyond. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. I'm now honored to introduce Sofia Thornblad, Chief Curator and Director of Collections and Holocaust Education for the Sherwin-Miller Museum of Jewish Art in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She has a BA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Keene State College and an MA in Museum Studies from the University of New Hampshire. Originally from the East Coast, she lives in Tulsa with her partner and their various pets. In her free time, she participates in local community theater productions, both as a historical consultant and performer. After her presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Sofia.
Hi, everyone. Rachel, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be speaking about Theodore Fried. With my background in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, when I first came to the Sherwin-Miller Museum and found out that Theodore's work was really the gem of our collection, I was really thrilled to dig right in and learn about this person. So without further ado, I'll get my presentation started. Just bear with me for a second while I share my screen. All right. So Theodore Fried, who was this guy? We're going to start with his childhood and then move along through time. And again, there'll be time for questions and answer afterwards. Okay. Tivadar, or Theodore Fried, was one of 5 children, son of Samuel Fried, a jewelry and watchmaker in Szeged, Hungary. Tivadar had 9 half-brothers and sisters, which were a result of his father's second marriage. Mrs. Fried paid close attention to her children's choices of future professions. She wanted Tivadar to study medicine, but he was interested in painting, music, and horses. So his older sister studied to become a doctor. Tivadar studied the violin. He lived the life of an art student, painting and drawing, and hid the disappointment he felt that his father had promised to one day buy Tivadar a horse to ride across the Hungarian plains. Samuel Fried had a successful business and held seat number 88 at the newly constructed Great Synagogue, but his father died tragically when he was 9 years old. His death affected him greatly and left the family struggling economically. As a young man, Theodore set his sights on a career in art. He entered the competition for a scholarship to the Royal Academy in Budapest and received one of the 12 available positions. The students deemed talented enough were encouraged to leave Budapest to study in Vienna or Paris, the center of the continental art world in the 1920s. In a threadbare suit clutching a German dictionary, Fried set off to find a place in the European art world. At the turn of the 20th century, Hungarian painters and their contemporaries looked to France and adopted French methods and styles. Indeed, artists of all nationalities were daring to use bold colors and embracing new ideas. Theodore, encouraged by the success of other young Hungarian modernists, was advised to try Vienna first. He had enough money for sardines and bread for 3 weeks, so he made the rounds of the galleries to present his work. The 22-year-old hauled 70 drawings and 10 oil paintings from door to door, until on the 3rd day he was offered a one-man show at the Hugo Heller Gallery. He found lodgings with a half-brother who had settled in Vienna and began to exhibit with the artists of the Vienna Secession. Successive exhibits and some sales allowed Fried to stay a year in Vienna and then to move on to the center of the art world, Paris. Arriving in Paris just before his 23rd birthday, he set up a studio in Montmartre. His first year in Paris was lonely and frustrating. He did not speak French and had no friends in the city. He soon learned of a gathering place for Hungarian artists, the Dome Café, where he met André Carrège, who would become a lifelong friend. Several galleries accepted Fried's paintings, and soon his work was included in salons and group exhibitions. He began to build a reputation through exhibits in Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Prague, and Amsterdam. Having found a place in the circle of Eastern European Jewish artists, informally known as the School of Paris, Fried continued to exhibit in the salons of the day that featured the work of modern artists such as Chagall and Sotin. His circle of friends included sculptor Jacques Lipchitz and photographer André Carrège. But Fried was also invited to exhibit with a new movement of artists, one called the New Generation. These artists joined the School of Paris in the mid-1920s. They were more politically active and were distanced by a generation from the early modernists such as Picasso. Like Fried, they took what appealed to them from modern movements of the early 20th century, Cubism, Fauvism, and Expressionism. But their works seemed to be a synthesis of elements rather than a singular extension of these movements. Fried's work in the 1930s, for example, included elements of Expressionism, of Cubism's geometric patterns, and of modernistic realism, but also looked back to the conventions of Renaissance portraiture. His later still life paintings recall Cézanne's influence on the School of Paris. His work was concerned first with line and form, but progressed slowly to an exploration of color and light. The political and economic situation in 1930s France was not conducive to a stable career, and Fried made his rent in any way he could. He worked as a dress designer in a small shop, played part-time in a movie house orchestra, and was a member of a marionette theater company. He also illustrated magazine articles under various pseudonyms. Theodore met Anne Pulitzer in Paris. A friend in Vienna recommended she look up Fried to see his paintings when Anne traveled to Paris. When they met, they walked through the streets, having coffee in a workman's bistro, and then going to his studio in Montmartre. It was a high up in a narrow house with only a table, a chair, a coal stove, and an easel. They fell in love quickly and were married. They had one son, Christopher, or Risso. Jewish immigration to France was on the rise. By 1936, the enactment of the Nuremberg laws made it clear to German Jews that the German government wanted them to immigrate. And by 1938, 30% of the Jewish German population had left the country. Theodore and Anne, living in Paris, were aware of the growing anti-Semitism in Europe and met Jews in Paris who had come from Germany. In 1937, Fried's painting Blind Toymaker, along with paintings by Van Gogh, Chagall, Kandinsky, and others, was included in the exhibit Entartete Kunst, or degenerate art. Degenerate art is a term used by the Nazis to describe most modern art, banned on the grounds that it was un-German, and those identified as degenerate artists were subject to sanctions. Degenerate art was mounted by the Nazis in Munich in 1937, consisting of modernist artwork chaotically hung and accompanied by labels deriding the art. To have appeared in the Degenerate Art Show is today a great honor, but in those days it meant death. Fried said, "Quite a lot of honor came to me because of that show. Having been thought of as dangerous as these men makes me feel rather good." However, inclusion in this show was a blow to his career. Collectors of his art in German-occupied countries either destroyed their Fried paintings or hid them in places where they could be damaged or ruined. In 1938, he decided to emigrate to America with his family. His family was to leave before him as he was under contract with a publisher to furnish illustrations for a book. In applying for visas, his Austrian wife Anne had no problem, nor did their son Christopher, who was born in Paris and hence a French citizen. But when Fried applied for his visa several months later, he was told that the Hungarian quota had been filled. His name would have been put on a long waiting list, and it could take several years for his turn to come around. As German invasion seemed imminent, friends appealed to President Leo Blum to grant him a special visa, but to no avail. It was not France, Blum replied, but America that had a quota system. It was therefore up to America to make exceptions. Appeals were also made to American Ambassador Butler, but again to no avail. Shortly before the Nazi army marched into Paris, Fried, along with Jacques Lipschitz, left for southern France, both eventually settling in Toulouse. In May of 1940, Germany invaded France. In June, the French surrendered and signed an armistice with the Nazis. France was then divided into two. Northern France, the occupied zone, was placed under German control, while southern France, the unoccupied zone, was placed under the control of a new French government that was established in the small spa town of Vichy. Almost immediately after the occupation, both the Jews living in occupied zone and those in the unoccupied zone were subjected to the first wave of anti-Jewish measures. The French police agreed to round up and arrest Jews for deportation in exchange for a great deal of independence. In June of 1942, the Germans forced the Jews in the occupied zone to wear a Star of David for easy identification. They also began arresting large groups and restricted the movement of the remaining community. The roundups continued throughout the summer. On July 16th through 17th, the French police rounded up Jews in Paris, jamming 7,000 of them into the Velodrome de Hive sports stadium for days without food, water, or toilets. Thousands more Jews were arrested and sent by cattle car to a transit camp in the Paris suburb of Drancy, from which they were deported to the east. The Vichy authorities also arrested and deported Jews from their zone. Altogether, 42,500 Jews were sent to the east during 1942. Fried established himself in Toulouse as a portrait photographer, among other things. The other things included forging passports and other documents for the Jewish underground. He used his skills as an artist and as a photographer in this delicate and secretive work. He came to know many people who were each day risking their lives. Frequently, one of his contacts in the underground would disappear. Word of their torture or disappearance, perhaps to a slave labor camp, would eventually reach him. There are many different resistance groups and underground groups operating in both occupied and Vichy France from 1940 until the war's end. There was the French resistance, who worked to eject the enemy Germans for France. Then there were the numerous Jewish underground groups who concentrated on rescuing Jews, and they feared that if they did not intervene, no Jews would be left alive by the end of the war. The Jews in southern France were scattered throughout many districts, which hampered communication between members of the underground, but also reduced the chances of their discovery and detention. In order to carry out an arrest, the government officials had to find and identify the accused. A Jew who left home could no longer be harmed by the police unless betrayed. The American Friends Service Committee, a relief organization administered by the Quakers, provided aid to refugees and concentration camp prisoners. AFSC was involved in working with resistance groups and coordinating visa applications and permits, securing money and sponsorships from abroad, and guiding refugees into safe territory. By 1942, the Quakers felt that Fried was in danger as he was getting too well known. They began at trying to arrange a way to get him out of Europe. No one is sure what Theodore Fried did or where he went when he realized it was time to leave Toulouse. It is known that the American Friends Service Committee was indeed able to secure for Fried one of the visas available for endangered artists to immigrate to the United States. It was with mixed feelings that he agreed to leave. Although he yearned to be reunited with his family, he had also realized his greatest success as an artist in France. But his friend Jacques Lipschitz had secured passage the year before, and a letter from him was encouraging. In order to reach America, the process involved boarding a ship in Marseille to reach a camp in Casablanca where refugees from France awaited passage. Fried then had a safe conduct to America, as well as a visa for passage to Casablanca and then on to New York. After World War II, Theodore worked to settle in America. For the first year, he stayed in New York with his friends. His wife, Anne, lived in New Jersey with their son, Risto. By the time the couple could be reunited in America, years had passed. They'd grown apart and agreed to divorce, but remained friendly until the end of their lives. Theodore met and fell in love with a German woman, Marie Engelhardt. She lived in a house with a number of German artists who introduced her to Theodore. Maria was a teacher, an artist, a woman who loved house, home, and garden, and children. In her letters to Theodore, she called him Dearsy, and talks of her love for him, her students, and the details of her daily life. After the trauma of the Holocaust, Theo's career was destroyed in Europe, and he had lost most of his family to the Nazi solution. Maria helped Theodore learn to live with his losses and begin again. Perhaps like the gardener and teacher she was, she planted new seeds for Theodore and taught him how to nurture his new life. For Fried, even though coming to America saved his life, it was another new beginning. In his biography of Theodore Fried, Milt Ellenbogen writes, "America meant another language to learn, new friends to make, and a reputation to be gained. The art of post-World War II was to be vastly different than Europe. It was not just the large number of experimenters in abstract expressionism and other contemporary art forms that brought about this change, but rather it was commercialism and the drive to put high monetary value on art. Taste was created by promotion, and often it was the artist in the forefront of his own promotion. Fried found this distasteful and refused to bend to the wind. However, his inspiration to paint was never greater. Slowly, determinedly, he assembled his materials and began to work. It was, as he foresaw, starting over. But for the first time in years, he felt secure about his life and art, and this was reflected in his paintings. With his wife Maria by his side, Theodore shaped his new life in America. By 1965, he had established a studio in Chelsea, was actively involved in the Hudson Guild as a teacher, and in the Federation of Modern Painters and Sculptors. He had his first one-man show in 1945 and exhibited in numerous galleries and museums, for example, the Whitney Museum. The couple applied for and got an apartment in the newly created Westbeth Artist Community, a rent-supported complex on New York's West Side. Theodore lived there until his death in 1980, painting in his studio and organizing exhibits in the Westbeth Gallery. With the new life came new themes in Fried's work: brighter color, experiments in abstraction of the human form, gigantic cityscapes, children at play, and landscapes of astonishing beauty. He was addicted to painting and painted every day, working out problems or experiments in composition he set for himself. When he finished, he played his violin. In 1972, the Frieds purchased the old parsonage, a home in the town of Otis in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, where they spent the summer months. It is a town nestled along several lakes and ponds and the gentle slopes of the Berkshire Range. Otis was established in 1810 by travelers seeking new land in western Massachusetts. Milt Ellenbogen wrote in an article for the Otis Gazette, "The old parsonage was a perfect house for Ted, as the large, bright living room where the former parsons welcomed their guests afforded him a magnificent artist studio, and every summer Ted and Maria would vacation here from their apartment in Westbeth." Theodore Fried was constantly involved in the art community level. With his wife Maria, he founded and for 20 years directed the Hudson Guild Art Project, which became the prototype for similar programs in other communities. Theodore also taught the project's classes for children and adults. The Hudson Guild is a nonprofit settlement house, a community-based organization whose mission is to strengthen and build community, both within its walls and the broader Chelsea neighborhood. Hudson Guild, founded in 1895, is one of the oldest settlement houses in New York City and hosts a community artist program showcasing artwork at 2 galleries at the Guild and sponsoring a community theater. I do want to just pause and quickly tell you about this particular portrait. Betty Allen was one of the most famous opera singers of the time, and she also happened to be Black, so she was one of the first just really, really famous Black opera singers in the United States. They organized exhibition in Hudson Guild's finest art gallery, where some artists who were later to become famous had their first showings. the project won the support of the Joe and Emily Lowe Foundation, which continues to sponsor the Joe and Emily Lowe Art Gallery at Hudson Guild. In April of 1979, the Frieds were honored at a memorial exhibition for Maria, who had passed away the previous year. At that occasion, they received a tribute of many of their associates, as well as Hudson Guild's board's members and executives. In 1969, Fried's studio was largely destroyed by a serious fire, but shortly afterwards he was able to move to the newly created artist studios in the West Beth artist community. Fried continued to specialize in teaching etching and the techniques of woodcuts, and he continued to do this and create different exhibits connected to the West Beth graphics workshops for the rest of his life. Fried passed away in 1980, and in fact, he painted this self-portrait shortly before he passed away, and he left a great legacy and a trust that needed a home. This trust included the vast majority of his artwork. Of note, some of that did include some of his pre-war work, which he had hidden in various locations throughout France. He was able to go back in the 1950s and then again in the late 70s to retrieve what could be, retrieved of this work. A lot of it had been lost or destroyed. So enter the Sherwin-Miller Museum. In 1980, after he passed away, the trust was created in order to promote and care for Fried's personal collection, which includes both a vast amount of his work as well as archival material. They were shopping this collection around, and a lot of different museums and organizations that were interested wanted, simply part of the collection as opposed to the whole thing. When they were in conversation with our museum, it became clear that not only we wanted the whole collection, but also that it would be the jewel of our collection, the highlight, if you will, and that we would be able to really work with this particular collection extensively, and we have. So it came to our museum in the early 2000s. Collection themes, you guys can probably guess what they are, having seen some of his work here. Interestingly enough, and I didn't particularly highlight this, there was a really big focus on performers of different sorts. So not just musicians, you definitely saw musicians, but also an influence of theater, particularly Shakespeare, Greek mythology. There's also a whole series on acrobats, which is really interesting. It's mostly oil on canvas in terms of like our larger framed work, but we do also have, studies for a lot of his bigger pieces as well. And then much of his pre-war work that survives is just works on paper. There have been several exhibits. Shortly after the collection came here, there was a retrospective. Again, oftentimes we focus on different themes. Currently on view, we have Art in Hiding, which focuses on his pre-war work. It's the first time any of it has ever been exhibited. So that has been really exciting to frame and display this work that literally survived the war. There's no way to verify whether or not these works came over with him or if he retrieved them afterwards. My guess, based on what I've been able to discover, is it's probably a little bit of both. But either way, none of these works have ever been exhibited before. And then the Big Beautiful Fried exhibit, as I mentioned, after he came to the United States, his style changed a lot. And there were a lot of these just like really big, expansive works, mostly cityscapes. They have this urban feel. So those are also on view for the first time. We do have future plans that include a traveling exhibit or two. We really want to make this collection accessible to other museums and institutions because there are a lot of different directions, just historically and otherwise, that you could go with. So we're working on that right now. The idea is to start with Art in Hiding and expand on that and have that be available for people to bring to their museums and institutions on loan in the near future. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to take some questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Just returning here onto the screen. Give me a second. Oh no. Uh, okay, why don't we? Okay, there we go. Thank you so much, Sophia. This was an amazing introduction to Fried, and I'm going to start with Susan's question, who can't figure out why she never heard about Fried. So,
Yeah, so I can see, Susan, your questions in the chat. So I'll address all of them. In terms of why people have never heard of Freed, first of all, I'm working on fixing that. And I was so delighted when Rachel reached out with this opportunity to talk about Freed so publicly. I think, honestly, what happened with Freed is he was becoming really popular in Europe, and then that all came crashing down. And he never really was able to continue to build on that fame and notoriety here in the United States. I'm not really, I can't tell you exactly why that never happened for him here. He was certainly in the right place. You would think like New York City, that's the place to be. He was really active. But that's part of our goal, is to get his name out there, because he truly is a gem and his story is fascinating.
mhm,
Um, his connection to Judaism, it's interesting. I mean, he was born Jewish, and it sounds like, from what I can tell, especially as a child, Judaism was really active, like an active part of his life. And I think it sort of continued, in some of his work, you can see there are some of his paintings kind of harken back to more of like a shtetl vibe. Some of his landscapes, you can see Jewish life here and there in his work, but it's not like an overarching theme. So I think, like I don't recall learning if he was a member of any sort of synagogue when he came to the United States, but it was certainly a point of nostalgia for him, if that makes sense.
mhm. But actually, the West Bath community is really an artist community. It's a huge apartment complex that has combined studio and living spaces at a very low rent that is uh, uh, city sponsored and still exists today, but the complex included a synagogue, not only a gallery space, but also a synagogue, and everyone in this building is an artist, including dancers and performers and any any kind of art. So it's a very vibrant and active community where he settled.
Yeah, I think he really, I think he really felt at home and had a strong sense of place, both in New York and then in the Berkshires as well, which, you know, after a difficult time there for a while, it's good to know that.
Mhm. So, who was in charge of his trust? He had a child, right?
He did have a child, and I believe they maintained a good relationship. I mean, he maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife, the mother of his child. He was not in charge of the trust. I believe it was other family members and a friend or two. And I'm not sure exactly what that connection was. I do know that there were several trips kind of like back and forth to New York from the curatorial team at the time. Um, I can't imagine how exciting that must have been for the museum to receive this
Mhm.
amazing gift. It's really a gem. I've said that before during this talk, but there's really no better way to describe it.
And I find it really amazing that you said you're planning travel exhibitions.
Yeah.
So That's an amazing thing, and also the digitize that you digitize everything, which makes makes it so much more accessible, the work. So Naomi is asking, are there any of his works in Hungary or Austria?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. And same with, I do know there are some of his works in other museums in the United States. Um, but I don't think so. I think a lot of that, um, much of his European work was destroyed or
Mhm.
lost from when he lived in Europe. But I'm not sure like if he ever exhibited in Europe again after he came to the United States. I don't think he did. That doesn't mean that there isn't work in collections elsewhere in Europe, but I'm not sure.
Mhm. And if it's private collections, it even gets trickier to find it.
Right. Right. I'm sure there has to be,
Mhm.
something floating around somewhere.
So, who destroyed the work?
Mm.
Caroline is asking whether any of his works looted, so destroyed during the Holocaust.
Yeah, so because he was a part of that degenerate art exhibit, it meant that his work and he himself as an artist were both targeted. We don't have many specific examples besides that one work, The Blind Toy Maker, that we know was kind of stored away in a place where it deteriorated and was unsavable at the end of the war. But also his work that had been sold to people who were in German occupied areas, which I think I also mentioned this, that work would have been either hidden or destroyed as well. So there were certainly many examples of his work being destroyed or kind of like forgotten about, which is really unfortunate on
Mhm.
so many different levels.
Yeah, I mean the degenerate art exhibition was targeted at. I
Yeah,
mean this whole action was targeted at museums.
right.
Um, yeah, and private collections. I mean the Nazis raided not all private collections. That wasn't possible, but they certainly knew
Right.
where the work was that they were interested in. So. And yeah, I mean, a lot of people also left and fled and for different reasons and couldn't take much with them. There's
Well,
that.
and that was the case with him, first to Toulouse and then overseas. His work ended up being just left different places.
Yeah, he was very lucky that he got out.
Yeah, I just one of those miraculous stories. I think it being famous, because at that point he was relatively so, was kind of it was both a blessing and a curse because you were a known wanted person, especially as like a modernist Jewish artist, but then that also made people who were trying to help more aware of your existence and more able to help. um, yeah, there's also, I wanted to add, um, he and Chagall kind of knew each other, and there's this rumor that Fried, it was sort of like a legend that Fried met Chagall at the docks in New York City when he arrived, because he was also rescued. But it turns out the timelines don't work out, but that's a really nice, like, fantasy, but it's not real history. We don't think that that actually um, happened, but there was some connection with them. They were in the same circles, both before and after the war.
And of course, a lot of the Jewish refugees came to New York, especially
Right.
a lot of artists. So there were all kinds of different artist circles.
Yeah.
Uh, it's interesting. Yeah. So Faith is asking whether there are any of his works available for purchase and whether there are reproductions for purchase, maybe.
So we don't have prints available right now. That changes from time to time. I have found different works by Fried, they've come up, various auctions. Every once in a while we'll kind of search and see what's going on. Our museum director actually purchased one for her own collection that will probably end up at the museum someday. So if you're interested in, original work, it can be found. It's sometimes a bit hard to come by, just, due to circumstances. But yeah, I would just recommend looking at different auctions.
Yeah, just Googling the name. Did you find any reviews of his show in Vienna, France, elsewhere in Europe?
Yeah, we have in our archives actually pamphlets and different advertisements for shows of his or shows that included his work in our collection, and that's pretty exciting. I speak a little bit of German, so I can sort of understand what they're talking about. But in terms of exhibits from other places, I'm not totally sure. That's one of those things where a next step is to really dig into all of those and have that information be available as well. And that's going to be a part of what happens when we create these traveling exhibits. One of the ideas behind that is to have kind of different versions of the exhibit, one where it's stuff that people can reproduce on their own, like text panels, things like that, and then also have physical exhibits that we can, ship around.
Wonderful. So Laurie says his oils look very soft, almost like chalk pastels. How would you characterize his technique and brushwork? And I want to add another question. You said that his work changed so much when he came to New York. So what's the difference between the European?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, across the board, he mostly worked with oil paintings. That's what the majority of his work was. Some of it is due to the fact that I don't think we have a lot of his. Oh, one problem, by the way, he didn't date a lot of his work, unfortunately. So some of it is when we're analyzing his work, we have to kind of like put on our thinking caps. Some of it is dated, and some of it you can also tell just like due to his style. I think his work actually got more abstract as he was in the United States for more time. A lot of his portraits kind of have this twisted, vaguely Picasso-esque, but more realistic feeling to them. His work that we have in our collection pre-war, a lot of it is sort of this sketched, like pastel on paper or like a drawing. We have a really interesting, and I should have perhaps included it, we have a really interesting series of pastel work that he did on graveyard scenes in Paris, which is just like they're really bold and colorful. And I think a lot of it was he was inspired by what was around him. So there's a more urban, modern feel once he gets to New York, and a little bit more of a romantic, vaguely like a combination of modernism and Renaissance when he's in Paris, if that makes sense. I also want to add a little disclaimer here. I am not an art historian by any means. I'm a historian really of the Holocaust and the history of World War II, which means that some of the technical questions about his art are not my area of expertise.
That is good to know.
Yeah, it is good to know.
So, very different theme. Susan Shender Googled and found numbered print of his on eBay for $184. So, and says hopefully Sofia will purchase it.
I'll have to look at that when we get off of this call. That's so interesting. Yeah, we definitely
eBay.
see his work on eBay sometimes. Different galleries will also sometimes have it, but yeah, cool. We do sometimes purchase his additional work for the museum.
So how many prints did he do?
Oh my gosh. I'm trying to think of like which percentage in the thousands. I want to say we probably have 1 to 2,000 prints in the collection. Don't quote me on that.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a lot, multiple file folders or drawers just completely full of his work.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's the majority of, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you know where he printed? Most probably in New York, right? But
Yeah. I bet we have that archival information somewhere. I think it was a couple different places.
mhm. Because that would help with the dating probably, and
Right. It would.
yeah, and also, I mean, West Bath might have an archive. Might.
I bet they do. I think a lot of, well, I guess that would be separate from his own
Mm,
archive because we didn't, the trust didn't have, it was just his personal archive. So
right. Yeah. Yeah.
more to dig into for sure.
Well, just is, I mean, it's not just.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And Laurie suggests with his connection with the Berkshires, an exhibit at the Clark would be excellent. So
Yes.
somebody
Yeah.
has if contacts, yeah, that'd be
Yeah,
cool.
the Berkshires connection is really interesting. I'm from New England, so New Hampshire, but you know, we would go to the Berkshires every now and then for a little vacation. And so now I am curious about the Fried connection there and would love to see what's there also, um,
Yeah,
in terms of records and other historical institutions that may have information pertaining to that part of his life specifically.
yeah, right. So much to discover. That's exciting.
Yes, that's the thing is a lot of work has already been done with regards to Fried in terms of, just research that's happened at the museum, but there's just a wealth out there to dig into. And it's really, our curatorial staff is one person. Um, so it's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge for such a small museum.
Mhm.
But we owe it to Fried as, the centerpiece of our collection.
Yeah, of course. And Laurie is asking, how does this work fit into the overall collection of the museum? Why was it right for your collection?
Okay, so I love this question. Our museum started as a small gallery. A lot of times it would just be that we would have specific exhibits featuring different artists, but our actual collection was very heavy on Judaica and Jewish life and culture. At some point, it was discussed by the board, the staff at the time, that we really wanted to be featuring fine art more and more. And to this day, his is our, biggest collection in terms of work by an artist. But it has ushered in a new era for the museum, and we are, seeking new collections as well. But his is certainly the biggest and brightest.
Mhm. And how large is the Jewish community in Tulsa?
So there's around 7,000 of us, which is actually quite a bit bigger than we thought until recently. That's of that 7,000, probably only around 2,000 to 3,000 are like actively known people in the community who are tapped into Jewish life. Um, so we're really, it's so unique to have a museum of this caliber dedicated to Jewish art, life, and culture in Tulsa. So it's pretty exceptional. We also serve, because it's a relatively small Jewish community, the educational component here is so important because a lot of our, I would say over half of our attendance is school children who come through for tours. So through our museum, they learn about the vital history of the Holocaust, but they also learn the basics about what Judaism is, who the Jews are, what the rest of Jewish history looks like. Um, and that can be really humanizing, especially when a lot of students here don't even necessarily know a Jewish person or know that they know a Jewish person.
Right.
So that's one thing I really love about our museum.
Yeah, that's very important, and it's great that so many school class do come into the museum. Is Holocaust education mandatory in Tulsa and in Oklahoma?
Yeah, so legislation was passed in, I believe it was 2020. It was shortly before I got here. It's not technically mandated, but it essentially it reads like a lot of those mandates. It's a strong suggestion, so it's heavily emphasized um, in terms of professional development for teachers, which is really wonderful. You know, Oklahomans have access to our museum, but then there's also in Dallas the Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. So there are various touch points. We also have a separate organization, which is the coalition based off of the Holocaust legislation that's working to develop curriculum, and so we at the museum work closely with them. It's definitely an exciting time um, in Oklahoma with regards to that.
Yeah. So Laurie is asking, outside of students, are you able to attract non-Jews to the exhibitions?
Yeah, I would say a lot of the other folks who come to our museum are non-Jews passing through town who have heard about our museum, for whatever reason. One of the difficulties of our museum is certainly that we're a little bit off the beaten path. We're quite south of downtown, and Tulsa really lacks in public transportation. So people do kind of have to seek us out in order to find us. But yes, a lot of the folks who come to see our exhibits are non-Jews, tourists essentially, who if you stop and talk to them, usually their impression is that they've learned something, and of course that they're surprised that this place exists here in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, wonderful. Um, Andrea asked whether any of Fried's imagery related to the Holocaust. And I
Okay.
would like to widen the question to whether there are works that relate to his flight, his exile, like his personal experiences.
So, from what I can tell, no,
Mm.
which is really interesting to me. Um, there are some images, kind of generic looking images of prisoners, not necessarily concentration camp prisoners. We're just talking like malnourished people clinging to bars. That's the closest I can really see to that uh, in terms of like thematic images. There are also some hints of pre-war Europe in his post-war work, if that makes sense. And a lot of that has a feel of rural Hungary. Um, but no, there's no like series he did about his, wartime experience. It pops up in sneaky ways here and there, but he never, I don't think that was something he was interested in exploring artistically in a way that would make for a really great exhibit about it today.
Um, do you know when he learned about the fate of his family?
I don't know. I think it happened gradually. by the time he was in the United States, things had also started to get pretty rough in Europe. But we do know that he had, at least that half brother in Paris. There were other family members who were scattered in different parts of Europe. But no, we don't have like a timeline. My sense is that it was kind of a gradual, he stopped hearing from people, after his move
Mm-hmm.
or after he was rescued.
Yeah. Okay. So Susan asked a very specific question. Do you know if Arthur Feldman was involved in the Fried acquisition? He was
Ooh.
at museum, was executive director at your museum.
I'm actually not sure who was director at the time. I do know I'm aware of Arthur Feldman. I think he was a little bit before this. Karen York was the curator at the time, and she was here for some time. I'm more familiar with her relationship to what happened because, as curator, hers are the files that I have often looked at. She did a lot of the research that I just presented to you because when the museum acquired this collection, she dove in head first and just went to town. I think that's pretty much all she was doing for a couple years, and rightfully so. But yeah, she did so much work. I don't think it was Arthur Feldman. I'm not sure who it was. I think it might have been right at the end of his time here. Great question, though.
So another question: Do you as a Holocaust educator, a scholar, do you find it easier to teach about the Holocaust with the artwork or not?
Yes. So it's funny because we are a fine art museum, but our permanent exhibits focus on Jewish life and culture and the history of the Holocaust. So telling those stories from a perspective that includes both history and art can be really meaningful. When I'm giving tours to groups of students, we have this particular installation in our Holocaust Center that depicts Kristallnacht, and it's a piece that has it vaguely reminds me of a wind chime. So it has shattered glass hanging down and a destroyed synagogue. I always ask students what they think about it and whether or not they have sort of a visceral reaction, because oftentimes half of the group will say that it unsettles them because it's beautiful and beauty should not be associated with the Holocaust, right? And then the other half will say what is my opinion, and that is that it represents the destroyed beauty of synagogues at or during Kristallnacht in a powerful way. So I think art can obviously allow for different interpretation and for people to emotionally connect in a way that's appropriate and accessible, when sometimes just like hard facts, statistics, imagery in terms of like photographs, primary source imagery can be a bit, you can separate yourself from it, whereas art requires you to engage with it in a certain way. So that's a very long answer, but yes, I think it's a really powerful tool in teaching about the Holocaust.
Wonderful. So Laurie asked a very specific question, whether Fried ever got the horse that his father never gave him as a child.
I don't know. Good question. I think there were horses, or he had access to horses in the Berkshires.
Okay, that makes sense.
But horses are all over the place. He loved horses in his work. There's a painting, it's on exhibit right now in our museum, of a little boy with a horse.
Mhm.
And there's no way to be for sure, but in my eyes, that is little Fried with the horse he never got. Um, but yeah, he was really just captivated by them. I don't know if he ever actually got a horse. I really hope so, or at least like learned to ride and, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Susan is asking, is his son still living?
I don't believe so now.
Hmm. And none of his wives.
No,
Okay. So they all basically died before him, or?
I think the son died after,
Hmm.
but both of the wives, Maria died before him. I'm not sure if Anne died before him or shortly after, but she's also deceased.
Hmm. Yeah. I just gonna read Susan's comment. Sophia, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank you so very much and want to wish you good luck with your really important work. And thank you so much for bringing Theodore Fried to our attention. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for your questions.
Thank you. All the best.
Take care.
Take care.